Okay.
So Brad, it's good to be with you to discuss your recently published book, Out of the Embers. You're certainly a prolific writer, and many fine books coming from a variety of disciplines, actually, from biblical studies, church history, philosophy, theology, public thought. But this newest one is Out of the Embers, Faith After the Great Deconstruction. Why did you choose the metaphor embers?
Yeah, I was thinking about those people for whom their faith has seemed to gone to ashes. But as you start poking at the ashes, you realize there's still some live embers left, and perhaps that in people who believe they've deconstructed beyond faith, there's really something that inexplicably remains. And certainly that would have been my case during the course of one of my meltdowns, but a very serious one in 2008, where I can't explain it, but I believed that God was good after all. And that felt like a gift. It didn't feel like something I could drum up. So I like that word inexplicable, but it was as if those around me, like you and other friends, were poking at the ashes, and you could still see something alive there. And that was sort of the basis of that metaphor.
It's quite an apt metaphor, actually, when you think of many people, they're raised with sort of a sense of the fire of faith and what it means to them. But it's red heat, and often that doesn't last.
Mm-hmm.
And then there's the challenges of life, the difficulties of life, the painful elements of life, the intellectual tasks coming their way. They have to make sense of in the world. It tends like water on that fire.
Yeah.
And as a result of the water in the fire, then as you rightly say, it turns to embers. And then does the fire go out? Or how can that fire be reignited if possible? And if so, how would that occur? So in the book, you've divided it into three sections. First section is memoirs. Reflect on that a bit with me in terms of the purgation and liberation.
Yeah, so in that first section, I begin with some of my own memoirs of experience, where I can recognize how complex this popular word, probably misused word, deconstruction, has been applied. So even in my case, there were elements of my journey that were voluntary and others that were involuntary. There were aspects that were very much liberating and other aspects that were devastating and traumatic. And just by way of an example, some of my theological deconstruction really was joyful and liberating as I discovered accretions on my theology or constructs of God that were ugly and unhelpful. And as those began to fall away, my experience of God really expanded, and that my sense of the goodness of God was enlarged massively, and it was a happy time for me to, let's say, letting go of penal substitutionary atonement, where there's this retribution in God who needs to satisfy his wrath. But if he doesn't, if he's free to forgive, well, that's glorious to me. On the other hand, there's other elements that, and by the way, even though that was theological, it wasn't purely academic. It affects how you live when you see how that God is good versus angry. There's a pastoral element to that, and then the flip side was that there were events that were happening in our lives, a lot of death, a lot of tragedy, a lot of trauma, and they began to accumulate very quickly until I wasn't sure if I could trust God. And that part felt like really unfamiliar and scary, and it affected my ability to function normally even. And then maybe I would also add that for a lot of folks, that you can have that full range of the spectrum, and because people are complicated and their stories are complicated. So one aspect of that first section that I'm trying to deal with is to say, I've seen two unhelpful responses to that complexity. one unhelpful response is hand-wringing pastors who treat all of that kind of journey and the forays into doubt as if it's backsliding, and that these people are just falling away, and I need to somehow herd them back into my fold and almost like control their journey. The other side I felt really unhelpful were those who've made an industry of deconstruction, where they want to just be cheerleaders and empty the pews, burn it all down. You're doing great, move on from your faith, and leave that garbage behind, and life would just be better. And meanwhile, I was getting messages from people who were saying, life isn't great. I've now gone into isolation and alienation. I lost my community. Some had lost their marriages, some had lost their jobs, whatever, even ex-pastors and so on. But they're like, these guys that are cheerleaders for deconstruction, they're not taking my trauma seriously. They just sound like evangelicals who want me to give a good testimony of this second conversion. And that felt like toxic positivity. So I thought, is there a third way? And for me, that begins with empathy.
Interesting that you call it memoirs. Very, very similar to a confessional approach, isn't it? Like Augustine's Confessions, or Newman's Pro Vita Apologia Sua, or Tolstoy's Confessions. Any of these, and you have such a range in your history in terms of the emerging in an evangelical background, a certain understanding of the Reformed tradition, entering into the charismatic renewal, and becoming orthodox, obviously engaging the larger philosophical, theological terrain in your PhD that you did with me on Grant and Simon. So you bring a richness, almost a Renaissance richness, to your confessional or memoir reflections. And it's so true, isn't it, that you can get the pastoral element that says you've got doubts, so you must be losing your faith, where in fact doubts may be a way forward into faith. And then you get the deconstructionists that often don't deconstruct deconstructionism. Right. But it can lead to deep nights of the soul. It can lead to isolation, which is soul shrinking in many ways. So part one is a lovely start, coming out of personal experience, just not an academic sort of chess game with ideas. It has its pastoral implications as well, a very personal journey. So part two, then you move on to the Seven Sleepers, which is a very interesting turn into a certain mother lode and gold mine. Comment on that.
Yeah, so I was thinking about if people are really in a vulnerable place, and some of them are even experiencing their deconstruction as a kind of mastectomy, where they knew there was a cancer that had to go, but they didn't realize how much of themselves they were going to lose. Then do you really want to invite plumbers in to work on your mastectomy? Or should you get experts? And who are the great experts? And so I ran into this curious legend that actually is venerated as a feast day in the High Church, and even appears in the Quran. And it's this story about the seven sleepers of Ephesus, who they're under persecution. They go hide in a cave, but they get bricked into the cave by the emperor, and they fall asleep. And then they're discovered and wake up like 300 or 400 years later, depending on which version of the story. And now they emerge into a world that's quite different, where the gates of Ephesus even have crosses on them, and I thought, it's a funny time machine kind of image. And I thought, what if the great experts of deconstruction were to suddenly wake up in our context right now? What would Moses, the great deconstructor of the golden calf, what would he see right now? What would he say right now? How would the apophatic theologians of the 3rd and 4th century, who were all about moving beyond constructs, dismantling them to serve faith, what would they see and say right now? And then I included both what I call frenemies, the so-called enemies of faith, who actually have some important things to say to us, including deconstructing deconstruction. Voltaire did this, Nietzsche did it, but also who were just as harsh on Christendom, but faithful in their discipleship. So Dostoevsky and Kierkegaard and Simone Weil. And I thought these are the real voices I think we need to hear now, lest our deconstruction be too shallow. The problem's not dialing it down. The problem is it's not been thorough enough to get through death to resurrection.
Yes, deconstruction by its very nature, it can become its own absolute.
Yeah.
So often people who've grown up in absolutist backgrounds, certainty, no place for doubt, the content shifts from certainty of, say, a conservative evangelical background, the certain need for an answer again. So deconstruction becomes the answer. And of course, it's a dead end as much as the conservative. Both are dead ends, and it leaves people empty in their soul and imagination, mind as well. But often deconstruction, it's one thing to destroy, to take apart, something to construct. It takes a much greater mind to creatively construct. And the greatest intellectuals in Western and Eastern history know how to deconstruct, but they also know how to thoughtfully construct and articulate a vision good. So what do you see would be the difference between the deconstruction, say we lightly touch on maybe Voltaire and Nietzsche, but those who not only deconstructed but reconstructed a much deeper understanding of Christianity?
Yeah, so and this is where maybe we need multiple metaphors. So for some of them, one metaphor I would use is they understood deconstruction or negative theology as, and even tragedy, as a birth canal that's going somewhere. And so instead of seeing deconstruction as a destination and a terminus, if you see it as like a birth canal, you don't want to be stuck in the birth canal. There is great labor in that birth canal, but we're meant for more, and we're meant to come out, and we're meant for rebirth of some sort. Or another would be like, if deconstruction is simply like, I'm growing and my clothes don't fit me anymore, and I need to let go, but then what will fit me now? What will be rich enough? So that would be another metaphor. And so another one would be like art restoration. Is the point of art restoration scraping away at a masterpiece, or is it uncovering the masterpiece? So I started just really seeing the variety of metaphors that take us to the other side, that take us into something positive. And sometimes that's actually taking us back to our roots. So it's like, what are the things that buried the masterpiece in lacquer and bad paint, and so you get these different movements within the faith, where Kierkegaard, for example, he's not abandoning his faith. He's trying to explore how to find it within Christendom, and ultimately still calls us to engage and follow Jesus.
Yeah, certainly. Kierkegaard being in that Danish Lutheranism, which had become very bourgeois flat, it did not speak to the depth of the internal life, and intellectually it had become rather thin. Kierkegaard, the great integrity he had, was really probing to say, what is this Lutheranism, and back of that, what is this faith, and what difference does it make in terms of my understanding of myself, as well as the self and society as well. Rich.
He makes the new atheist seem shallow.
Yes.
Like he's way more thorough and devastating in his critiques, but it gets you somewhere.
Yes, yeah, he liked Dostoevsky, and these are profound. Interesting enough, the Jewish prophets were preeminent deconstructionists, weren't they?
It's the tradition, isn't it?
Yes. So built right into the biblical Christian tradition is deconstructionism, but they were also constructionists as well. They pointed to where we should not go, but also pointed to where we could go if we want to get the great views of the great ridges of our faith and the great blue canopy above.
Yeah, that reminds me of the end of Isaiah 58, where he's like, he's done a devastating critique of all their idolatries and injustices, and then he shows up and says, and we're going to be the rebuilder of ancient ruins and cities long devastated. So there's and this is what they mean by when they end most of their books with a promise of a new covenant, right? That this is unto something.
Yeah, difficult living in the tension, isn't it, between necessary deconstruction and the necessary construction. Some people construct without deconstructing, so it becomes often their construction is an idol.
Yeah.
And then some people deconstruct without any construction, which itself is its own sort of idol,
Yeah.
isn't it? But living in that trying tension makes for a mature person in their imagination and thinking and their faith. And so that tension is, how do you see that tension being thought through in your book?
Well, I do kind of go after the pop deconstructionists in that sense, where it's like this is just a kind of shallow evangelicalism rehashed. Mm-hmm. So now you need to have a good testimony of how I left the church, and my life is much better now, and that my deconstruction is sort of a second conversion or a deconversion, and now I'm supposed to put a happy face. Mm-hmm. As if this has solved all my problems. I just got rid of faith, or I just got rid of church, or I just got rid of, and now, and it's just not listening to people's stories. And I'm like, that was the problem in the first place. We weren't hearing the doubts. So can we make space to doubt deconstruction itself? And so I try to do that there. But I also then, in that third section, I'm looking at what is the faith that comes after deconstruction? Who are the voices that I could trust? What would, if it didn't mean this other thing I used to think Christianity meant, what can it mean? And so some examples of that are, I feel like the black voice in America, the black church, the black gospel carries some nuggets in it that people like Howard Thurman were willing to really examine the way Christianity had been colonized. But at the end of the day, he stands at the cross. Him or James Cone, the cross and the lynching tree, where it's like we're not moving past the cross. So for me, that's the epicenter of reality and the cosmos. Another would be, why are the martyrs willing to die for something? What would they die for? Were they being silly, or is there a kind of faith worth living for? And then also just then re-examining, I thought the kingdom of God was one thing, but what if it's something else? And I had conversations with my godfather David Goa about that, and he talking about faith as a living connection, as exchanges of grace, as not just heaven someday when I die, but how I live in this world now, as presence in communion. So now I'm beginning to think, okay, after deconstruction, once you've realized that's not the end game, then who and how might we live in the 21st century with an authentic faith that can survive? Just to backtrack a little bit, that's why Dostoevsky was so important to me, because in books like the Brothers Karamazov, he faces the problem of evil and tragedy head on in ways that the pop deconstructionists haven't even explored yet. He undergoes the weight of that and still walks away with, Alyosha still has faith after all. But it doesn't sound like the modernist apologists. It looks like a kiss, Yeah.
No, there's obviously a depth in Dostoevsky, his novels, his short stories that take you to the much more profound deconstructionism, but also a much more significant and mature construction of what it means to be in that deepest sense. Yeah, I like Kierkegaard, and I was also thinking about many years ago. I did a lot of work on Martin Buber, and this would be central to Buber's I, Thou, I, It. He faced much deconstruction in his day, and then reconstructing, thinking through the Jewish tradition, the prophetic, the mystical, in his Hasidic work, and as well as work on his work on the prophets, in
Yeah.
which he, Abraham Heschel was a student at Frankfurt. But yeah, these great thinkers that you're.
And how faith for the Jews could survive the Holocaust. That's an example of faith after a great deconstruction.
Talk about, yes, where is God?
Yeah.
If we talk about something like the Holocaust and the notion, because much of the biblical account is the eminence, the presence of God.
Yeah.
You know, things like the Daniel in the lion's den, the Red Sea parts, and these are all sort of fairy tale, happy ending. God is there to guide you, but what happened? Holocaust. So
yeah. Eli Wiesel, or however you pronounce his name. There he is. He's on the gallows.
Yeah.
In Auschwitz or wherever.
Yeah. So I think any thinker who's grappling with their faith in our time has to engage these multiple tragedies, and then where is the presence or the eminence of God? And then the tendency is to say God is absent. So you either do he's just transcendent, not here, you slip into deism, or you just burn the whole thing. But in Embers, you've got, yes, that wood can be burned, and probably that wood of a certain understanding of faith has to be burned. But in these embers is the potential for the white heat of a new faith. And white heat of fire is always much hotter and more intense than the flickering red flames. Yeah. Any other thoughts on the book that you think you'd like listeners to?
Well, I'm just very grateful for your engagement, and that in many ways this is fruit from your tree and your mentorship and walking me through, particularly, I suppose, in one of the darkest periods of my life. You pointed me to Simone Weil, and she figures prominently in this. She's sort of my diatoma, you know, and how she is able to address the issue of the infinite distance between the goodness of God and the affliction of humankind, and how the cross spans that distance, and that there in the heart of the one hanging from the cross, we see the intersection of that goodness and that affliction, and from his wounds pour a kind of healing into the world. And that, I don't think that's a theodicy. It's almost an anti-theodicy that is to be experienced as at the foot of the cross. And you set me on that course that ultimately led to spending 4 years just immersed in her and George Grant, her disciple. But there's a reason why he had said, next to the four gospels, she's my highest authority. I feel that some days, but it's because she profoundly points me back towards the cruciform as something that I found in the embers.
And certainly, I think, as you mentioned earlier, these are not only sort of intellectual academic discussions, they have serious pastoral implications.
Oh, yes.
So for you, and I think for most of us who are interested in people, we realize the pastoral, the relational implications of going too far down a deconstructionist road on the one hand, and where it leads to, but also uncritically buying into a version of the Christian faith in which you're shrunk almost into a tomb or into a cave. And that's, how do you break out of that sepulcher and resurrect into a vision which is higher and richer and more dynamic than either the very narrow, shrunken version of faith that anyone who's minimally alive has to break out of that tomb.
And you will see stories of that. I have anecdotes of those who, in the midst of their darkness, I was able to engage with and who exemplify exactly what you're describing.
So a fine book out of the Embers. Do purchase, do read, and do, as the Anglicans would say, inwardly digest.
Thanks so much, Ron.